You kids can't keep your heads to yourself.
I'm gonna turn this car around, and there'll be no Cape Canaveral for anybody!
That's it! Back to Winnipeg!
With so many possible choices to go for, it's understandable that some variants may gain popularity over others. Not necessarily priority, but popularity nonetheless. In most cases, this is justified, since they bring a fair share of utility to their respective field. However, there can usually be some instances of a variant that's been way overhyped out of its initial usefulness, to the point that can be deemed as overrated. By that same token, there are also variants that have been largely overlooked for one reason or another. Maybe some dipshit gave a bad take, or it's relatively niche. But through experimentation and effort, it can turn out results almost, if not just as good as most of the meta-centric variants. And that's what we're gonna be doing today, a top 5 of both overrated and underrated variants. But you must keep in mind the following: overrated does not automatically make something bad, while underrated does also not turn it into a meta staple right off the bat. I know this should go without saying, but it often happens that people assume otherwise. Also, despite being top 5s, they're not placed in any particular order. But hey, who doesn't enjoy a countdown format? Nevertheless, let's begin with the overrated list, shall we?
Bird up!
Kicking off this list, we have an entry that really shouldn't surprise anyone: Goldstones. Yeah, it's been several instances I've mentioned him in a poor light, but for good reason. He's really basic, but he still gets a surprising amount of praise. Not that he doesn't have a merit of some sort. As a beginning choice, he's definitely functional, and I can safely assume he carried many people's early games. That's great and all, but eventually he falls off in favor of generally better variants. The thing is, there's an absurd amount of overhype towards Goldstones, as being one of, if not the best bronze variant, even though sketchy exists. It's likely due to a change of the mechanics, not accompanied by a change of perspective. Back then, stun was a lot more powerful, not locking your moveset between their use. But by patch
2.6,
this changed to the current mechanics, gutting most stunners' proficiency. But Goldstones endured as a popular pick thanks to being cheap and accessible, despite being a far cry from his former self. Nowadays, just being able to stun can only get a character or variant so far, which is why over time he became less favorable and resented by the seasoned player base, out of still managing to get praised to hell and back by newcomers. And to be fair, when you have access to command grabs and haste for said command grabs, stun proves a redundant debuff. The one positive to the world that Goldstones did was spawning No Le Sabes a Goldstones, originating from the 9th circle of hell known as SGM Facebook. Thanks Angeluso, your sacrifice is never forgotten.
Bird up!
At number 4 we have Vaporwave Vixen, a prize fight reward with surprisingly noticeable popularity, but an overall underwhelming ability. It's mutually understood that the unflinching doesn't do anything of note, and it's rarely used in conjunction with a second ability that's actually any useful. Thorns and Miasma enable Vape as working for offense and defense, bonus points for also functioning as a longshot variant. But her condition for gaining this is her biggest weakness. You have to stall out for 2 seconds without attacking or getting hit. Keep that last detail in mind. It goes without saying that unless you manage to stun the opponent for a really long time, you'll only be able to, at most, stack up to 3 Miasma stacks between knockdowns. It is understandable why the attacking condition is present. If it weren't, she'd be a Miasma version of Overclock. At the same time, it's too limiting if one intends to keep a fast-paced combat, since you have to switch between stalling around with the AI, hopefully cooperating, and actually attacking. It's a janky mess, but yet again you gain Miasma out of it, so it's understandable why people stick with her. Defensively, she's nothing more than a skill check. There are several ways to go about it: trident through buff control, or constantly apply pressure until you find an opening, by repeatedly hitting her on block, dash back, and repeat until she chooses to attack. Philia usually pulls this off the best thanks to her high mobility, and evasion on dash back. All in all, god damn it Takealon, you should have won that day!
Bird up!
At number 3 we have Starshine. Most players seem to understand she's not as good as she may initially look like, but there's still cases convinced that she can actually work. Unfortunately, her biggest strength is also her biggest weakness. The permanent precision takes way too long for her to benefit from it, provided some fights can last longer than 30 seconds, but that doesn't mean you're off the hook yet. During that period, the opponent has ample time to counter Starshine through Curse. If that happens, you're forced to tag out, tag back in, and try again. Now, the reason as to why people still think highly of her is either the precision itself is a good enough attractive, it certainly was back then, the stats she has are overall bad for an attacker, and mixed with Annie's offensive capabilities she pulls through prize fights anyway, or the reference. It's the fucking reference, isn't it?
Bird up!
Going into number 2, we have Bad Hair Day. Currently, her only application is bleeding. Incredibly basic, but good enough for a bronze, especially as means for long shots. But here's the catch. After the buff to Philia's moveset, BHD's presence feels way lesser, since you can spam Ringlet Spike, and that's already a minus 12% health chipped out. With this, any Philia can instantly become a longshot user with little to no investment required. You may think, okay smartass, anyone can use Ringlet Spike, so what? She's still valuable for being a starting choice. Fair enough, but for total damage per second, it's been proven that Frayed Ends comes out on top, as having bleeding enemies gives her extra attack. Sure, you could say that BHD can achieve 5 stacks naturally, but the guaranteed nature of Ringlet Spike is simply far more effective that renders her not as practical. But hey, at least she has the first cut as a crutch. So anyway, here's one playthrough of Majora's Mask. I'll say it, Leech BHD isn't as much of a meme as it once was. She definitely gets the most use out of TFC, but again, Ringlet Spike outdoes TFC in bleed proficiency, and it's not affected by resistance a second time, and recovery is much more practical for the long battle. But yet again, we're talking about nothing more than a longshot variant and a bronze, so you cannot go wrong with either, even if people tell you Leech Bad Hair Day bad. Bird up! And in number 1 for Overrated variant, as well as proof that this isn't done in any set order, we have Flight Trap. Now sure, she's competent enough and can take care of threats, but has a lot of downsides to her. Her highest attack in the game is alluring, but the problem is the low damage output of her moves. It's not as strong as it should ideally be, compared to the other fighters with close enough base attack like Jin Freeze and Shadow Puppet, and their respective outputs is much more noticeable. And the comparisons don't end there, as they also outclass Fly in terms of healing. Granted, 5-stack regeneration is desirable, but it doesn't compare to the consistency of Leech and Fuqua's blockbusters. Not to mention how vulnerable to bleed and curse it is. And last is the fact that her damage scaling doesn't function properly, only taking base attack into consideration, so her overall strength is both gimped in her damage output and in her ability. She can still provide results on the occasion, but doesn't compare to other self-healing sources, or high damage sweepers.
Qué bien chido, es buen pedo. No dudo que lo sea. Bird up!
Kicking off with the underrated list, let's start off with the Range Shadow. You haven't seen her very often in defense, and it's for a good reason, but her ability represents a concept I'd like to see furthermore explored in other defensive abilities: buff clearing. If used on the right context, it could contribute with recovery and immunity counters, and on Dark Season, for example, it can certainly prove annoying. However, there's a reason we don't see Range Shadow very often. Her first weakness is being restricted to work only from her own side of the field. Not to say it's a bad condition by default, but it's very easy to control as the player. Furthermore, that's her only major defensive attribute. The power surge is not that effective, and while she benefits from Frost Armor, you could very easily counter her regardless. Offensively, she's a passable buff remover, but she's conditioned on camping from her own side, so her gameplay wouldn't differ much from the likes of Soul Sister. But the periodic 5-second window could prove slow, albeit consistent, as long as stun doesn't get in the way. And hey, she can synergize with Wonderkind, so there's that. Bird up! At number 4 we have a variant that, if not underrated, definitely deserves more praise, that being Bloody Valentine. She's likely overlooked due to her low attack and seemingly low utility because of it. Turns out that very low attack happens to play to her advantage rather than against her. Yes, it's the old and tired story of Don't Poke the Bear, and Bloody Valentine just so happens to have several advantages to her favor. The constant healing through specials mean that she's capable of taking recoil, and thanks to Liza's kit, her usefulness rightfully climbs upwards. With up to 4 specials and 1 blockbuster, that's about 40% health you can recover through special spam. And with enough cooldown and weight of Anubis, you can repeatedly keep the enemy locked down. Her one downside aside from attack would be the need of a specific set and stat lineup to make the most of her, such as high health to reduce recoil and special cooldown to increase the spam as much as possible. Very fun variant though, really glad I got her shiny and invested at half the cost. Bird up! The spot for number 3 will be occupied by Nearly Departed. I've mentioned her a fair share in the past, and the same positives and negatives still apply. She's not practical to use on prize fights, but has one major niche in Rift battles, that being invincibility, to tank reflex sources such as Immoral Fiber, Assassin's Creed and Blue Screen's Power Surge. That's great and all, but if she just tanks these sources, then plenty of other variants can also do that at a faster rate. Luckily, she has 2 extra attributes to further contribute: immunity through Taunt and Curse through Dragon Punch. With this, she's able to bypass Blockbuster or Final Fight, all mixed with invincibility gain. But aside from her low attack, as well as the need for meter gain, she heavily relies on good timing for your combos, and the AI bursting midway could lead to a shift in strategy as you have to reorganize with a lower health bar on the enemy's end. But all in all, Nearly Departed can hold her own in the late game, all thanks to an easy gain of an overpowered buff.
Bird up!
Number 2 will be Graveyard Shift. Her main reason to being underrated is living under the shadow of Killjoy. Where Killjoy prevents failure, Graveyard Shift rewards success. Her main attribute is to grant heavy regeneration whenever someone dies, teammate or opponent. This makes it so that everyone can enjoy some form of recovery, and in Rift battles any form of recovery is appreciated. Her relevance has actually increased as of recent, because of the severe punishment of duplicates, meaning that you can no longer slot 2 or more Surgeon Generals in a Rift battle. Graveyard happens to be a decent alternative, at least on the regeneration field, although her disadvantages would mostly lie on having to occupy a slot for support, or it would become redundant if the character or variant can recover on their own, like Leech Phileas. She's not as popular as Killjoy because of the lack of an instant revival. Except she has it now. Yeah, Graveyard Shift is better than Killjoy, end of story, lmao.
Bird up!
Last we have Neanotech, an extremely overlooked variant, on the account that she can prevent debuffs by herself pretty consistently. By deploying a head drone you gain a 10-second variant, and while set buff is active, that makes it so any debuff source like, say, Assassin's Creed's Heavy Bleed won't be inflicted as long as you have a singular barrier stack active. And because it's an useful buff required, that doubles down on her potential to take on reflect damage. Her main downsides involve requiring a fair amount of attack invested to make her work, and constant head drone spam. You don't have to use them for attack, mind you, but you are conditioned to launch them at a constant rate. Also, the fact that her barrier is timed is both a negative and a positive. Negative because you won't be able to tank Reflect for the entire match, but positive since it synergizes with Rockstar's ability, working as easy meter gain. It's a variant that requires a lot of resources, and the right situation to make the most of it, but also one that can pay off.
So how about 609, Radio Graffiti?
I would beat the ever-living shit out of you for getting shiny Robocopy day one. Out of that alone, I will kick your ass, Kevin. You stand no chance. You motherfucker. Stop getting good pulls. I will beat you. You fucker.